Welcome to the International Money Cafe podcast, the show where we filter out the noise on cross-border taxes, finances, and life in the US. I'm your host, Jen Neefam, certified financial planner, founder and owner of Algon Financial Advisors.
And I'm your host, Manasa Nadig, enrolled agent, owner and founder of Amen Tax and Business Services. Join us on this journey as we explore the unique challenges faced by inbound, outbound families and businesses on taxes, compliance, and financial planning. Let's get to the show.
Today's topic was triggered by a very interesting conversation Manasa and I had last week. One of our clients is interested in investing overseas. And it actually got us talking about how recently we seem to be getting a lot of questions from US persons wanting to invest in real estate outside the country. So this is either in their home country or another country that's not the US or their home country. And as we all know, real estate has been and is a very popular wealth building tool. And seeing what's happening with the US housing, with the prices going up, it kind of makes sense that people want to look outside. So in today's episode, we're going to answer 5 questions that we've seen on real estate ownership. There are a lot of areas we may or may not cover. It just depends on the questions that we answer. And the other thing I do want to point out is this is people investing in real estate, or they may have inherited or this real estate was gifted to them. So we're going to address US citizens, naturalized or born in the US, permanent legal residents. So this is folks on green cards, as well as foreign nationals on work visas based in the US. Because remember, all these rules apply to you being considered a US person. It all comes down to how you file taxes. So let's see, Manasa, we got 5 questions. Which one do you want to tackle first?
All right, Jane. Nice setup there to lead us in. And yes, if you are one of these people that we just talked about, and if this does apply to you, we've seen that the big question for you is, now I've decided that I have this rental property abroad or I am going to get a rental property abroad. How do I determine the value of this property? And that always starts off this discussion with, how did you acquire this property? If this property was purchased by you, then, obviously the value of this property is the cost of it, plus whatever expenses you had in acquiring the property, as well as maybe having to set it up as a rental. What did you have to do to the property? Maybe you had to add in more cupboards, let's say, so that you could rent it out. So all of those expenses, right? So if you purchased it, that's what it would be. The cost of the property incurred, plus all of the expenses like closing costs and other things, plus all of the capital expenditures to set it up as a rental property. That is where you would start off as. Now, let's say you were lucky enough to have inherited a property from your family and it is situated abroad. Now, the fact that it is situated abroad will not affect the way that this property is valued in the eyes of the IRS. So we're going to get the same treatment that you would if it was in the US as far as the determining the value of this property, which is you would get a step up in basis. And what does that mean really quickly is that the person who owned this property before they died, the value of the property to them would have been different. But now that you inherited it, the value of it to you is the valuation of that property on the date of death of the person from whom you inherited this. So that is what is called a quote unquote step up in basis. So that would determine the valuation of this property if it was inherited. Now, let's say again, you're a lucky person. Let's just go with that. And this property was gifted to you. So what happens with a gift is that does not change the cost of the property that was to the giftor. It remains the same as what it is to you. So whatever was the cost of the property to the giftor is going to be the cost of the property to you. And that's how you're going to value this property. Let me mention this really quickly here, is that you may have other reporting requirements if this was an inheritance or a gift from a non-US citizen. And we can talk about that a little more later. Let's come back to the valuation of the property. So you have a purchase, or you have an inheritance, or you have a gift, and either one of these situations determines how you're going to value the property. And then this also includes land or commercial property or residential property. And, all of these fall into this purview. So do you think that was a good question to start with, Jane?
Yeah, so I think it really is, and it's great because now it's like, okay, I have this property, now I know what it's worth. So let me jump to the next one, which is, and I see this one all the time, if I own rental property overseas, do I have to report it in my US taxes? And the answer is yes, you do. So remember, the US taxes you on worldwide income, which means it doesn't matter where this property is. You could have a nice place on the moon. The US is still very, very interested in knowing what kind of income you're getting from that. And so you do need to include your rental income, I believe, on Schedule E. You're able to deduct expenses, things like management fees, let's say repairs, travel to go see the property, maintenance can also be deducted, mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance. So pretty much everything that you need to run this property. And this is now assuming you're using it as a rental property. You're also able to do your regular depreciation if it has what IRS calls determinable useful life and is expected to last more than a year. Now, the depreciation obviously does not include the value of land. And in terms of when you're reporting this, because most likely, or not most likely, this is going to be in a foreign currency, you need to convert that foreign currency into US dollars. And you can use the average exchange rate, or in some cases I've seen where you use, I think, the year-end rate. But I think the key thing to know is you do need to do the conversion. So you're reporting it in US dollars. And because I'm thinking about that, Manasa, why don't I pass it back to you to do the next question, which I'm sure has something to do with taxes.
Yes, Jane. So just picking up where you left off, because yes, we have now determined that this has to be, declared on your US tax return. So the next question obviously is, well, maybe not obviously, but the next question is, what forms do I need to report this rental income? And, this can get pretty extensive. So one, you already addressed Schedule E, and so I won't go into that. And the other forms that you might need is, remember, now you have a property abroad and you are collecting rent. So where is that money sitting? So if this money is being deposited into a foreign bank account, then we have the FBAR and the FATCA forms, depending on what the threshold is in these bank accounts and what the exchange rate is that you already talked about, right? So we have the Schedule E, we have the FBAR and the FATCA forms. And then if this rental is considered a trade or business, and typically that happens if you have more than one rental property in that country. And it could be that, it is considered a trade or a business. And if it is, then that rental needs to be reported on a form 8858. Now, the 8858 asks a little more information about the foreign rental and all of that on top of the Schedule E. So you have to send that in with your individual tax return. Now, we talk about the income, which you already addressed, income minus expenses minus depreciation. You might still have some income left over. And this income is now subject to US taxation. Now, let's say you are filing taxes for the same rental income in the country where the property is situated. And therefore, now what you have is a foreign tax credit, which is available to you. So if you do have this, then you need yet another form, which is the 1116, the 1116, so that you can tell the IRS, hey, I'm paying for taxes on the same income in that other country, and I can claim that as a credit on my US return. So we've got your Schedule E, we've got your FBAR and FATCA, and then we've got your foreign tax credit form 1116. Now, a little more complexity added to this, which is why, we love complexity, right? So if you've decided that this rental is now owned by a foreign entity, which means that this rental property is not directly owned by you, but is now housed within either a foreign corporation, a foreign partnership, or maybe even a foreign trust. And, maybe it's a practical decision in the country where the property is located that this should be how it is. But what happens is that now, if you are a majority holder, which is about 10% for a foreign corporation and partnership of this entity where the property is housed in, then there are additional international information forms that apply. And of course, if it is within a foreign trust, then we have to look at whether that's a grantor trust and a non-grantor trust, and we don't have to go into that today. But what that really means is now your foreign rental has added on all of these additional filing requirements. And most often than not, when you are at this stage, then you should be definitely working with an accountant in the country where the property is. And we may also be looking at working with an attorney in that country and sort of, also have a US tax attorney look at it and make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted and things like that. So heads up, it may end up, even after all of these things and the foreign tax credit, etc., that you may still end up owing taxes to the IRS on whatever residual income and taxes that came out after making all these calculations. So a simple question, what forms do I need to report with the rental income? But, there's a lot that goes into that, right, Jane?
Yeah. And I think after hearing about all these forms and the taxes, I'm going to enjoy answering the next one, which is, can I convert my primary residence to a rental property or vice versa? In this case, it really comes out to, can I convert my overseas rental property to a primary residence? And you are allowed, just like in the US, to convert your rental property into a primary residence. It, of course, means you're now living overseas, right? In that case, as long as the local rules and regulations apply, and as long as all the residency rules are met, you will be able to still use, the same, let's say, Section 121 exclusion when you get around to selling it. But the thing I do want to point out is this really applies to U.S. citizens and green card holders, because if you're a foreign national on a work visa, you own rental property, you move back home, you're pretty much done with the US taxes at that point. So this is only for green card holders and US residents. And I think that's all I want to say on this. So why don't I get it back to you, Manasa, for the next question?
All right. Thank you, Jane. Yes. After having talked about all of these, the next question that we get and we would like to address is, what are the financial and tax and the wealth tax implications of my exit plan from this rental property? That is, what do I do with this rental property if I decide that I don't want it anymore, or can I transfer this to someone else in the family? So that is something that is a plan that you need to put into place very, very carefully. And it doesn't matter, it could be a small property worth not much, or it could be a property worth millions, but you need to have a plan. So again, let's say you decided that you wanted to sell this property. So obviously, when you sell an investment, you have capital gains. And the length of the time that you have held on to this investment determines whether those gains are going to be short-term or long-term. In the US, short-term gains are investments that you held for a year or less. And long-term gains are investments that you held for maybe, a year plus 1 day. Let's just say that. So now this investment property that you have sold is subject to capital gains tax on your US tax return. And one thing that I have found interesting, Jane, is not all countries adhere to the same length of time to determine whether they are short-term or long-term gains, right? Some of the countries, and India comes to me in particular, is that they want you to hold an investment for 3 years for it to be considered long-term and for you to have a favorable tax rate on that. And, there are other countries, again, which have different holding periods to determine long-term or short-term. So you need to take that into consideration in your plan when you make this exit plan. And of course, we have already spoken about double taxation of the rental income. There is some aspect of it when you sell the property as well. The same thing. When you're looking at capital gains, are you going to be filing taxes in the other country? And are you going to be paying taxes there? And then if you are, then what's the timing aspect of that? And how are you going to be able to claim that as a credit on the gains that you may now have on your US return? So yes, so there will be the sale and there's the capital gains. So you really need to be looking at the holding periods. And also, depending on where the property is located, again, which country, there are these additional death and estate tax considerations. And each country is so different with the way that they tax, properties if the holder dies and how that transfers over to someone else. So you need to take that into consideration when you're making a long-term plan. And the same thing applies really, if you want to just hold on to this and then maybe pass it on to the next generation or even the generation after that. And then you really need to be looking at the valuation of the property. And right now it's a healthy 13 point some million dollars in estate exclusions in the US at least. But you need to take into consideration what that situation will be if you are a US citizen or a green card holder, and how does that country where the property is located look at it, and how are they going to tax you if you just transferred it, whether there's a gift tax involved and so on. So that's a question I get about, what should my exit plan be? Or sometimes I feel like that's the question I should get about what should my exit plan be when somebody is looking at purchasing a rental property or an investment property abroad. Yeah. So that's what I have, Jane.
I love it. But one thing I'm going to add to this, you've talked about, the tax and financial considerations of your exit plan. The thing I do want to add is there's a lot of cultural considerations when it comes to property abroad. So if I own a piece of property, let's say, and my family considers this to be ancestral land, or it's a property that was gifted to me by, let's say, my parents, and they wanted to stay in the family, I just can't sell it. And the assumption is that I'm going to be giving it to my kids. What I'm seeing a lot of happen, and you and I are in this same exact situation, is we came to the US as adults. So we already know the values, the cultural values, the expectations of owning property in our home countries. But our kids who are born in the US may not have that attachment, that sentimental value of some of these properties. And so what we now say to folks who are in our situation, you grew up in another country, your kids were born in the US, is please start having these discussions with your kids as soon as possible. Let them understand what owning property, especially family property, means in the home country or in the country that you came from. And let them understand that when it comes to selling it or keeping it, there's more than just the financial and tax considerations. They do need to take into consideration the cultural values. If there's sentimental value, they do need to add all that into the decision. It does make it a little bit more complex, but I also think it makes life a little bit more interesting. And so with that, Manasa, I'm going to pass it back to you to conclude.
Yes, thank you, Jane. So, you know what, my biggest takeaway from this discussion today would be investing in a rental property abroad, if I haven't already done so, or if I'm not inheriting or I'm getting a gift of it, is these are considerations that you should seriously think about. And definitely, like we always say, work with professionals on both sides of the border, as far, even if it comes to wills and stuff like that. And today we've covered this topic at a high level. And if you have more questions, dear IM Cafe listeners, please reach back out to us and let us know. We would love to come back and address more of your questions on future episodes, be it about real estate or other things. So yeah, and if you would like to do that, please go to our website, theimcafe.com. Again, theimcafe.com. And the easiest way to do this is just scroll down on the page and, where it says to subscribe to our newsletter, send us your email. We love to hear from you and we'll get back to you. And also, bonus, you'll be notified before anyone else when our podcast drops. So we look forward to hearing from you and we'll keep bringing you more and more such great episodes. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the International Money Cafe podcast. The content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for professional advice. Seek the advice of your qualified service provider with any questions you may have regarding your cross-border finances and tax needs.